Tak, jeszcze 2 minuty.
It's good to see you.
Hi, hello, how are you?
It's good to see you. I think this is on. How do I mute it? All right, we'll be starting soon. People are coming in, getting a seat, talking to one another. We'll start in a minute. All right. I'll need you. Okay. Whenever you want to start, we can start.
Yeah, there's just 3 people getting drinks.
Okay. So if you could press on camera.
Yeah.
And then on this one.
Okay, camera.
Yeah. So this is that. Well, I'll probably do it before I go up, so we're fine. Hey. Good.
Just a few of these.
Oh, what happened to these?
That's fine, sorry.
We got 1, 2. There was another stack here disappeared. Oh, he's putting it. You're putting it over there? Okay, let me know when I turn it on. Okay.
Is there anybody who doesn't speak Polish? Yaron?
I don't count?
My welcome would be in English. Just out of my curiosity, who do we have here? So thank you guys for coming. It's on behalf of Objectivism panel, Students for Liberty, and Brutality Station Point. Let me welcome you to this nice event with our superstar guest, Yaron Brook, who used to bring hundreds of people like 5, 6, 7 years ago to university classes. Apparently, we couldn't get to university Warsaw School of Economics because Yaron got cancelled there, but we have our lovely Freedom Lunch. Apparently the times are a bit different, less people are coming for such talks, but I'm even just more happy to see you because all of this happiness condenses on less people. So let me just welcome with applause Mr. Yaron Brook, and let's give him a thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tomek. Thank you all for being here. And yes, I miss the days where we could get hundreds of people in Warsaw to come to one of our lectures, but I'm counting on you guys to resurrect that. And next time I come, we'll have we'll be back to hundreds of people. You know, we're talking lately about these lectures and talks, and we sit here in Poland, and it's fairly comfortable. But one of the things that really is becoming evident, and if you follow what's going on, and you're tuned to what's going on in the world, or what's going on really not far from where we sit, is we're getting a real illustration in real time of the real brutality of war. Of what war is really about, just the devastation, the number of people who get killed, the amount of lives that are just being wasted, the total destruction that war involves. I mean, what is going on right now as we sit here, again, fairly comfortably, what is going on right now somewhere like Bakhmut, where thousands and thousands of soldiers, both on the Ukraine side and the Russian side, have already been slaughtered. Thousands and thousands are going to still die, probably, in the fields of eastern Ukraine, in little towns and little villages. The number of lives, families destroyed, not to mention the wealth and economic activity and future that now doesn't exist for so many people. I think for Europeans, for Western Europeans, this is somewhat of a shock. I mean, my generation, your generation even, right? This is a first. We really haven't seen anything like it. Maybe some in the Balkans with the breakup of Yugoslavia and kind of the Balkanization of that area and the wars that happened there, but nothing on the scale of what we're seeing now in terms of destruction and death and just complete devastation. I come from a region where this has been experienced in more recent memory. That is, I grew up in Israel, so I grew up living through wars in a very small country where the devastation maybe was not quite as bad as Ukraine, but maybe as a percentage of the population, maybe very close to what is going on in Ukraine. And the one thing you learn is there's no upside to war. There's nothing good that comes out of it. It is not even a zero-sum game. It's not zero-sum. What is it? It's negative sum. It's a huge negative sum. And it's not that one party, particularly in this war, it's not that one party gains and another party loses. It's true, and really in every war it's true, that it is a lose-lose activity. It is a lose-lose situation, and it's on a scale that is hard to imagine. What is maybe interesting is, for us, is how unusual war is for our generation. Because one thing that's important to remember is, and shocking in a sense, is this was kind of standard policy in Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years. The brutality, the lose-lose, the death, the destruction, the devastation. I mean, 30-year wars, 100-year wars, little wars in between, little wars after, little wars before. Europeans have been slaughtering each other forever, and indeed human beings have been slaughtering each other pretty much forever. This is not a new phenomena. Indeed, what is it that's new? What is it that's different? The lack of war is different. The lack of war is new. And I think we entered a period where we expected that lack of war to continue forever. And one of the things that this war is maybe teaching us is that we cannot take peace for granted. We cannot take the foundations of peace for granted. That peace, just like freedom and liberty, are things that have to be fought for on a regular basis. And to understand what it is to fight for peace, we need to understand what it is that brings us war. And what it is, when we fight for peace, what it is that we must fight for. So, we live in a time, obviously, of great turbulence. We live in a time where we have just gone through, I think, two periods. The period from the Napoleonic War until World War I, and the period from World War II to today, where for much of the world, these were incredibly peaceful periods, maybe the most peaceful periods in all of human history. And this is part of why I think what's going on in Ukraine right now is so shocking, is so surprising, is because we haven't seen anything like it since World War II. And even then, we thought World War I and World War II were aberration because we had lived through about 80 years of peace before World War I. So we have to ask the real question of why are we seeing war back on our doorstep? Why is this phenomena come back to haunt Europe, or to haunt really the world? And I think to understand that, we need to think about, at least in human history, what is it that brought about the peace of those 80 years in the 19th century and kind of the 80 years or the 70 years since World War II? What generated those peaceful periods? And maybe we can learn something from that relates to the causes of this war and the causes of war more generally. So what is it What is it that made the 19th century unique and made the 19th century an era of relative peace? 19th century. Before nuclear bombs. Well before nuclear bombs.
Prosperity.
Well, partially prosperity. And why is prosperity something that would lead one towards more peace?
War doesn't like, money doesn't like war.
What is it?
Money doesn't
Money doesn't like war. There's a lot to lose, right? There's a lot to lose from war. We're seeing that again today. Everybody is a loser, and when you're making money and when there's prosperity and the economy is doing well, then war is an impediment to that continuing. So prosperity, what else? What else would lead people in the 19th century? It's true, the 19th century is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Early in the 19th century, you're seeing increase in prosperity, increase in wealth creation. Human beings are better off. So, yeah, there's more to lose in a sense by going to war. What else would lead the 19th century to be a more peaceful period?
Relative freedom throughout at least the Western world.
Relative freedom in the Western world, the area where I think we're talking about when we talk about peace during the 19th century. Relative freedom, so freedom in a sense of individual freedom. And what does individual freedom mean? Now individuals do what? What do they care about now? They care about themselves. They care about their life. So if you think about history, most of history, individuals were taught, we were all taught, that we were just parts of, members of a tribe, members of a gang, members of a country, members of a religion. But in most of history, nobody cared about us as individuals, and we were taught not to care about ourselves. What's unique about the 19th century is that it's the period coming out of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is an era where we are taught, where our philosophers, our intellectuals, our educators, our public intellectuals are teaching us that what is important is the individual. The individual is of value. And indeed, we've now created a political system that values, for the first time really in human history, or maybe with a small exception of Greece, for the first time in human history, we have political systems that value the individual, that leave the individual free, that actually discuss the fact that individuals are free. And why are individuals, why is freedom for individuals a feature of the 19th century? What other ideas made it possible for us to come up with the notion that individuals should be left free, that individuals, and in themselves, the individuals are a real value?
Rule of law.
I think the rule of law is a consequence, something even before the rule of law, more basic to human nature. What's that?
Validity of reason.
The validity of reason. So yes, I mean, I think the great achievement of the Enlightenment is this idea that reason is a means of knowledge. We don't gain knowledge from revelation. We don't gain knowledge from some specialist, from philosopher kings. Reason is a means of knowledge, and every individual has the capacity to reason. Every individual can think for himself. And as a consequence, every individual can take care of himself. Every individual can make choices for himself. Right? I mean, before the Enlightenment, what was your profession? What profession did you engage in? Carpentry. Why did you engage in carpentry? Because you liked it? Because your father was a carpenter. And you had to join the guild to follow your father. You had very little choices in the 19th century. Oh, sorry, before the Enlightenment. Do you know why? I mean, this is a story I've told. I don't know if you guys have heard this story. But do you know why Leonardo da Vinci did not follow his father into being a notary, and instead became the Renaissance that he was, Renaissance man that he was? Leonardo da Vinci was a painter and a sculptor and an engineer and a strategist and an advisor to kings and so on. How did he get to do all these fun things when everybody in that period of time was born and had to do what their father did. They had to join the guild. That was, what was special about Leonardo da Vinci that the political and cultural system allowed him to become a Renaissance man?
Because he was an out of marriage son.
Yeah, he was a bastard.
So he wasn't allowed to join the...
He was not allowed to join the guild because he was born out of marriage. So because he was born out of the system couldn't impose its will on him. Indeed, the reason he was freer than most people is because he was an illegitimate child. And we are all lucky that his father had some affairs on the side and had some illegitimate children, because life would be a lot duller without Leonardo da Vinci and people like that in the world. So what we discover in the Enlightenment is the efficacy of human reason, and therefore the ability of the individuals to take care of themselves and make choices for themselves. It's not just we didn't choose our profession before the Enlightenment. What else didn't we choose? We didn't choose who to marry, right? We didn't choose our political leaders. We had very few choices. But suddenly, the idea that we all have this capacity to think for ourselves, we all can reason, liberated all of us. And suddenly, individual freedom became important. And people who care about themselves, people who are free, people who are individuals and leaving individuals free, what is the goal of it, as expressed at least in the, let's say, the Declaration of Independence of the American Declaration of Independence? What's the goal of all this freedom? Why be free? What's the purpose of it?
Human flourishing.
Yeah, human flourishing, or in the words of the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness. So if you're in a system that's leaving you basically free, you have the capacity to think for yourself. You have now, because you have this capacity, you have maybe a little bit of self-esteem, you're pursuing your happiness, you're trying to flourish. War, the destruction, the devastation, the murder is the last thing on your mind. You're not interested. And if you're pursuing your happiness and somebody calls you to arms in the name of the tribe, oh, leave me alone. I don't want to have anything to do with this. My life, my happiness. I'm not going to the bloody fields of warfare and dying on the field. For what? For what cause? Explain it to me, right? Reason. We want explanations. Give me an explanation for why I should die for this cause. What am I fighting for? Yeah, but who cares? I have land, you have land. We've discovered the concept of private property, right? We've implemented it politically to some extent in Europe, to some extent in the 19th century. Why fight? For what? For some mystical belief that I don't really hold anymore? So the era of peace is when we reject the mysticism and embrace reason. The era of peace is an era we reject collectivism and tribalism of all its forms and embrace individualism. It's not an accident that the 19th century is a relatively peaceful period, because it is a period of relative individualism and a period of embracing reason and a period of pursuit of happiness. I mean, the whole culture, particularly of Europe and the United States, the whole culture was a culture of celebration, the celebration of freedom, the celebration of individualism. You hear it in the embrace. You see it in the art. You see it in the literature. You see it in the music. It's a celebration of life. It's human beings, in a sense, reborn after centuries of slaughter and mayhem, centuries of the causes of slaughter and mayhem, which are basically two, which is what the Enlightenment undoes. Mysticism and collectivism. Every war out there, ultimately, can we leave them to the end, and I promise to answer all questions? Every war, ultimately, has been motivated, justified, explained in terms of either a mystical cause or collectivist cause, or usually Both. Usually, it's God's war. I mean, how many Europeans were slaughtered over whether you were Protestant or Catholic, or what type of Protestant you were, in some kind of holy war? How many Muslims killed Christians and Christians killed Muslims in the name of holy wars, generated by some mystical entity that inspired us to go out and slaughter the people who didn't uphold the same mystical views that we did? And how many of them were motivated by, we are the superior tribe, we are the superior being? And of course, that always goes together with a world that views what? Economics as what? As zero sum. So the only way to grow economically is how? To steal. So if you believe in zero sum, the only way to grow is to steal. And, in much of human history, because of oppression, because of authoritarianism, much of the economics was zero sum. So mysticism, collectivism, and a perspective of zero sum, I would say, are the three causes of war. They're the causes of, I think, World War I. I think they're the causes, it's kind of obvious that they're the causes of World War II. I mean, the Nazis had a clear mystical agenda. They had a clear collectivistic agenda. And they viewed the world as a zero-sum world where, the German people needed more resources to take on more of those, more of their needs. They needed to conquer the lands rather than what's a non-zero-sum way of growing an economy? Trade, production and trade, right? Trading with other countries, producing and trading with other countries. That's a win-win. That everybody grows. In the period after World War II, I think to some extent we returned at some level to the idea of a trade. Trade was formalized as a good thing. A lot of the agenda of the United States and the West was this idea of free trade. Trade is win-win. And then when the Berlin Wall came down, integrating former communist countries into this idea of trade. I think the real positive of the European Union, maybe there are not that many positives, but the one positive of the European Union is this idea of free movement of labor, capital, and goods. That is, free trade is a good thing. It's a recognition of that. So there's a recognition in the West post-World War II that the world is not a zero-sum game. There is a respect at some level for individualism, implicit, not so much explicit, but implicit, in the way we live our lives, in the way we organize our societies. As critical we are of the world, it was pretty good for you would have who you would marry. It still is in the West. And reason is still respected, not as much as some of us would like, but it's still respected. We like science, we like technology, we acknowledge the importance of the human mind, and for the most part, again, not as consistently as we would like, we leave individuals free to think for themselves, act for themselves, and live for themselves. And the pursuit of happiness has not completely gone out the window, as much as we love to be super pessimistic among those of us who are objectivists or freedom lovers of various varieties. So what brings us peace again is reason. What's going on in Russia? Well, I think what happened in Russia is we have public intellectuals and spokesmen who clearly do not believe in any one of these three elements that bring about peace. Indeed, feel threatened by all of them. Does Putin or Dugin or any of the intellectuals in Russia care about reason? Do they ever talk about reason? Is there any semblance of respect for the human mind in Russian philosophy today, in Russian thinking, in Russian ideology? No. And maybe you could argue there never has been. Maybe that's why Russia was so susceptible to a Bolshevik revolution, Maybe that's why Russia was so susceptible to communism. Communism is a form, I would argue, of mystical belief, of the negation of reason, even though it's called scientific. It is negation of science, certainly the science of man. It's a negation of human nature. It's a negation of the principles of economics. It's a negation of reality. And a mystical belief in some proletarian that we're all supposed to sacrifice for, and who rules over us through a dictator. I mean, you have to be pretty screwed up to believe in that stuff, particularly as implemented in the Soviet Union, as brutal as it was in the Soviet Union. So there's something mystical in the culture of Russia that manifested itself in communism. And even though communism supposedly was atheist, was secular, was anti-religion, that religion never left that culture. The mysticism never left that culture, because I think communism feeds off of that mysticism, feeds off of a religious sensibility, a religious sense. So when the Berlin Wall came down, when the Soviet Union broke up, the mysticism of Russian culture sustained itself. And you can see by the kind of spokesman, by the kind of rhetoric that comes out from the intellectuals in Russia, the extent to which they are still mystics. They believe in the spirit of the Russian people. They are devoutly, many of them, at least at the leadership position, whether they're just spouting this because they need it in order to sustain power, or whether they really believe it, doesn't really matter. But they claim to be Russian Orthodox and committed to that Russian Orthodoxy, and that is what makes them special and unique. They use religion to justify many of their political programs, much of their opposition to so-called, what they view as Western decadence, of mystical traditions, and a cultural mysticism, a belief in some kind of. You can hear this in every Putin talk. There's something about some spirit, Russian spirit that hovers above Russia, that is destined for greatness, destined for empire, destined to be meaningful. And every autocrat, every war that we've seen in human history always had a tinge of that mystical destiny that is being bestowed on you, the people, whether it's bestowed on, again, particular religions, or whether it's bestowed on particular individual leaders, or whether it's bestowed on particular peoples. So they have the mysticism in spades. And again, Putin's talks are filled with that kind of mystical explanations for what he's doing. They reject reason. They embrace mysticism. Is Russian culture today, really again, maybe forever, is Russian culture a culture that embraces individualism? No. I mean, there are many Russians that embrace individualism, and they've all ran away, or at least many of them have gotten away. I was just in Tbilisi, and there are a lot of them there, right? But Russian culture does not embrace the rights of individuals. It doesn't embrace individual liberty, individual freedom, individual expression. And as a consequence, they've allowed Putin, over the last 20 years, whatever freedoms they gained once the Soviet Union was broken up, whatever the freedoms they gained during a short period of time of limited freedom, Putin has crushed, taken away freedom of expression, taken away many of the individualistic freedoms that people had just a tiny little bit of taste of during maybe the 90s and the early 2000s. Russia has become more and more and more authoritarian. Russia has become more and more and more collectivist. Again, that collectivism that goes way back has been embraced again. They've embraced the tradition of Russian collectivism. So we have here a culture that's mystical, it's collectivist, and finally, we talked about this idea of zero sum. And I definitely think from an economic perspective, Putin's whole approach and Russia's whole approach to economics is one of, ultimately, zero sum. Russia has not embraced a market economy. It has not embraced the idea of trade. What has been the entire focus of the Russian economy over the last 20, 30 years? Resources. Single-minded resources. In a sense, Putin has done everything he can to destroy every other aspect of the Russian economy, I mean, that could have produced innovation and progress and growth, partially because, why suppress those? Partially because they require individualism, right? They require liberty. They require freedom. So you suppress them all in the favor of one thing, which is natural resources. The closest we have to a zero-sum economy is a natural resource economy. You take it out of the ground, you burn it, it's gone, right? Now, that's not zero-sum because, you know, you have to refine it, and indeed, there's enormous value to that natural resource for people who know how to use them. But it's the closest we have. And indeed, one could argue that much of his emphasis on southern Ukraine, not only are there more Russian speakers in southern Ukraine, but what else does southern Ukraine have? Resources. Southern Ukraine is where Ukraine has a lot of natural gas. That area in the Black Sea probably has natural gas under the water. There are many natural resources that Russia has and are focused on the eastern and southeastern region of, that Ukraine has, are focused on the south and southeastern region of Ukraine. It's all, you know, from an economic perspective, all the thinking is natural resources. And when you think about natural resources, how do we grow an economy? Well, we need more natural resources. And if growing the economy means we need more natural resources, then we need to go get more natural resources. And the way to get more natural resources is to conquer them, is to take them, is to steal them. So all three elements exist in this war. All three elements exist today in Russia. Mysticism, this idea that Putin expresses constantly of a Russian destiny, of a Russian spirit, of a Russian peoples, of the longing for empire, of a destiny that the Russian people are somehow superior to everybody else, and are, you know, born to rule and born to have an empire. And I think, again, whether he believes it or not, the fact that he has to use that messaging suggests somebody believes it, somebody buys into it. And I think it's very much part of the spirit of Russia. The collectivism, it's all about the state. It's all about Russia. I mean, you know, we really haven't seen a disregard for individual human life in warfare like we're seeing right now, really since World War I and World War II. Just, you know, what's going on right now is just, it's like the trench warfare. It's hundreds of, you know, just sending people to their deaths for inch by inch by inch by inch. I mean, there's no concept of, you know, fighting a modern war, using modern weapons. This is just getting a bunch of kids off the street, training them in how to shoot a gun, how to build trenches or whatever, and then sending them into battle. And the whole strategy of Putin seems to be in the East, just amass as many people as you can. In a sense, there's no strategy. Certainly not a modern strategy. I mean, some of the behavior of the Russian army is truly bewildering, given what we know about war in the modern era. It's like the last 50, 60 years don't exist, and all they remember is how they fought World War II, right? A war in which Russian army lost 27 million people. They might have killed 5 or 6 million Nazis, Nazi troops, but they lost 27 million people. So what, right? It's just individuals. The Russian people survived, and they still celebrate that as a great victory. Right? We can talk about how much of that was a real victory or not, or who actually won that war. Russia takes way too much credit for World War II, much more credit than they actually deserve. And then, of course, the natural resource economy, a zero-sum world. I think this is what drives Russia. This is what drives Russians. This is why Putin continues to have support because they all believe in this nonsense. I think the other element that is crucial here that explains what happened and why it's happened is Western weakness. That is, those of us in the West, or the countries that represent the West, particularly in Europe, in the United States, the principles on which made the West great, the principles on which made the West strong, have been slowly in decay, decade after decade after decade. The respect for reason, the respect for individualism, the respect for capitalism, freedom, free markets, are slowly being eroding. Indeed, mysticism is rising in the West in all kinds of forms, not necessarily in the form of religion, but in the form of negating reason and embracing all kinds of ideologies from on the left, you're seeing in critical race theory, all the way to the right with the rebirth of kind of nationalism, a new form of nationalism, which is resurrecting forms of ancient mysticism. So the West is abandoning the ideas that made the West great. And I think people like Putin and people like Xi can see that. They see it as a weakness. They see the deterioration. They see the infighting. In America today, it's clear to me that in America today, Democrats and Republicans, at least at the edges, hate each other more than they hate enemies of the United States. Indeed, they view each other as the primary enemy of the United States. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the wonderful congresswoman from Georgia, the one who believes in Jewish space lasers that do all kinds of weird things. She just tweeted a week ago that the United States needs a national divorce. We need to separate. We need to have blue states and red states and separate it out. An interesting concept that we can talk about if you're interested. But this is kind of the attitude today. There's no America. There's blue states and red states. There are blue people, red people. We can't get along. Everything's fragmented. Everything is in decline. Everything is broken. There is no unity. And that is the perspective, I think, of many people of Europe. Infighting, don't agree in anything, can't come together, general weakness. And of course, in the context of war, Putin kind of tested us. Right? He in 2008 invaded Georgia and nobody did anything. I mean, Bush made some noises that prevented Putin probably from going to Tbilisi, but he captured a piece of land and he said, okay, I tested, nothing really bad happened to me, this is good. In 2014, he took Crimea, tested the water a little bit, nothing happened. Everybody said, oh, sanctions, we're going to sanction this, sanction that. And then within a few weeks, everything returned to normal. Nobody cared. So I think if you combined his reasoning for going to war with also his idea that the West was weak and wouldn't do anything about it, combined with another delusion that he had, which is that Russia has a strong military and they could win this war quickly, that, I think, explains why he did it, when he did it, and why, to some extent, I think now he's stuck, because it turns out his military is not powerful. Indeed, it's very weak. It's much weaker than anybody in the West even imagined it would be. It turns out the West is far more united, at least in terms of stopping this particular action, this particular war, than he imagined. And he's facing much more opposition than he ever imagined from the West, never mind from the Ukrainians. So now he has to double up on all the other aspects, the mystical aspects, the collectivistic aspects, and see if he can find a weakness in the West and see if the West will hold, and hope that it doesn't, and hope that Ukraine somehow capitulates. At this point, I think he's just going to continue this. Just going to continue this with the hope that somehow something will happen that could lead him to be successful. But there's no reason to believe that will happen, not in the short run anyway. There's no secret that he has there that can somehow lead to victory. And of course, he has the nuclear weapon card to secure that nobody's going to come after Moscow. So he can engage in this war without suffering the ultimate consequence to himself. Right? He is not being threatened, at least not from foreign entities, maybe from inside Russia. He's not being threatened because nobody's going to attack Russia itself because of the threat of nuclear weapons. So the roots of war are the same roots that they've always been. Collectivism and mysticism and a zero-sum mentality. The solution to war is the same solution it's always been. Crush the bastards, right? Defeat them. Then offer better ideas. Offer ideas that reject mysticism, collectivism, and zero-sum. And those ideas are reason, individualism, and basically capitalism, the virtues of trade and the virtues of production. How this all ends is, I just don't know. I am optimistic for Ukraine because I think Russia's pathetic. I think the Russian army's pathetic. I think Putin, I don't know, did you guys see the picture of Putin in church celebrating Orthodox Christmas? Where he was all alone in a chapel by himself in midnight celebrating Christmas? Look this up online. It'll make your day because it's a great photo. I've never seen a human being that looked so depressed and miserable as Putin looked in that photo. It made me believe again, the reality actually works. Bad people suffer the consequences of their evil, if not from the external world, then inside. The guy looked like everybody, if he loved anybody, everybody he loved had died and his life was about to end. He looked pathetic. And there was a little sense of justice. There was a little piece of justice there. So it's worth...
Don't say that.
What's that?
Don't say that.
Don't say what?
This Putin in life.
I'm not sure I understand.
Okay.
Anyway,
Sorry.
he looked pathetic.
I'm sorry.
He looked pathetic. And he deserves to be pathetic. I hope that the support that Ukraine has gotten so far continues. I hope Ukraine manages to beat down Putin, but long term, particularly looking at China and looking at other parts of the world, if we don't get our act together around individualism, around freedom, around liberty, if we don't get our act together around what it is that the West stands for and what the West represents, if the U.S. doesn't get its acts together to unify and resurrect somehow the founding principles of the United States, then this is not going to be the last war. Unfortunately, this is going to be the beginning of a long chain of wars. Because the mystics and the collectivists out there in the world and in here, in the West itself, are on the rise because we are in decline. And as mysticism and collectivism rises, violence and war will rise with them. So this war might be the beginning, but the final and ultimate battle is an ideological battle. And it's a battle that all of us need to be engaged in, and all of us need to understand, and all of us need to be fighting. Because the future is bleak if the mysticism and collectivism wins, even if Russia loses. All right. Thank you. All right, you had a question.
First of all, I'm quite skeptical of the idea of 19th century as the era of peace. I would rather say it was an era of proxification of war, where the European powers discovered they could, instead of fighting at home, they can engage in colonialism. But ultimately, this system fell apart spectacularly into the greatest tragedy of human history, maybe the First and Second World War. But I'd like to ask a question about the present, because right now we have, I think we can deny we have a really grave problem. It's mostly visible in America, but also here in Poland and generally in wider West, with the people who are considered often libertarians who say they are lovers of freedom,
Yep.
but they adore Putin,
Yep.
either openly
Yep.
or they say they don't, but they parrot the Russian propaganda. They
Yep.
in the U.S. Congress, they on top of the media, and like, why is that?
Well, they run the Libertarian Party in the United States, right?
Yeah, he's like a villain from a comic.
So thank you for asking me that question, because I was doing my podcast the other day, and I was talking about the fact that I'm traveling through Europe. This is, I don't know, 5th stop or something. And people are asking, libertarians and people who love freedom are asking me, what's up with these American libertarians? And some libertarian in Europe got on my chat and said, nobody asked that question. Nobody cares. So thank you for asking that question. I did not plant. I didn't ask you in advance, right? Okay. I also want to comment on the 19th century piece, but let me talk about this for a second. I'll talk about the American libertarians because I think I understand them and know them better, I think. Maybe this applies to European libertarians as well. And then we could also talk about the conservatives, because I think conservatives are motivated by slightly different motivations than the libertarians. So the libertarians who are pro-Putin, and they are pro-Putin, you're right, some of them pretend they're not, but they're part of the propaganda machine. Most of them are anarcho-capitalists, call themselves anarcho-capitalists. Most of them are anarchists. And most of them come from a tradition, a Rothbardian tradition, of hating the U.S. government, of despising the U.S. government, and indeed viewing the U.S. government as ultimately the enemy in the world, the most destructive power in the world, and therefore, because they view the American government as the enemy number one, the enemy of their enemy is my friend. So anybody who stands up to America, anybody who, shows a little bit of muscle towards America, they respect and they admire and they support. Stories are that Rothbard during the Vietnam War used to toast every time an American pilot got shot down. An American pilot. You could be against the war without celebrating when an American dies, and without celebrating the success of communism, right? You can say, I don't think America should be in the war, but communism is evil, and I hope that the Vietnamese people, embrace a different system and reject communism. I hope the South beats the North. But that was not the attitude of libertarians, even in the 1960s and 70s. At least a certain part of the libertarian movement. It's their country. They get to decide what kind of regime to have, and if they want communism, so be it. We are the bad guys, so every time somebody shoots us, that's cool. And there's a real hatred among libertarians of America, and a real hatred particularly focused on what you'd call the American regime, the American system of government. And I think partially because it's a little bit of a repudiation of anarcho-capitalism, because here's a government that, as bad as it is, works pretty well, has worked pretty well, created this amazing, pretty rich, pretty free country. Over time, it's deteriorating, but it was good for a long time. So I think that's part of what motivates, there's a nihilistic streak in libertarianism. And I think that nihilism expresses itself in support of Putin. And again, not all libertarians, not all American libertarians, but there certainly is a segment of them that just, they want to see the world burn because they all think that out of its ashes, there'll be this beautiful anarchy. You can ask me about what I think will be out of the ashes, but I don't think it's anything beautiful. But there really is. I mean, there's a certain celebration of destruction. And you can see it in other positions that they've held over time, not just about war, but other things that are inherently destructive, and they support because it's destructive, because they want to see this world destroyed so that they can build the next. So that's, I think, a piece of the libertarian movement. And that might be true in Poland, might not be. I don't know enough, but certainly it seems to be that the people supporting Putin, which is a little funny, right? The anarcho-capitalists who want anarchy support the authoritarian. But it's a hatred of the free countries that represent, that things can actually be okay even with a government. The conservatives, I think it's different. The conservatives, and there are libertarians that care about this as well. There are paleo-libertarians, which is a concept I never knew could exist. But it turns out that they are paleo libertarians. Paleo means meaning that they care about things like traditional values and tradition, and they also care about maybe the color of our skin and our ethnic heritage and things like that. So the conservatives care about the fact, and you see this in Jordan Peterson. He says this, right? Putin represents to them a strong figure, a powerful figure, somebody who doesn't take any nonsense, and who stands up, and this is the most important thing to them in the world, stands up to the left. That's all they care about. The American right today is single-mindedly obsessed with the culture war with the left. It's all they care about. And if Putin says bad things about gays, they are ecstatic. They think that's wonderful. Finally, somebody's standing up to the whole idea of gay rights, which the Republican Party capitulated over the last 10 years, completely capitulated on gay rights. Which is good in my view, but in their view, obviously not good. And woke and all of this stuff, which they think American generally are weak on, Putin is strong on. So Putin, for them, represents true Western civilization. He represents tradition and Christianity and manhood and, the patriarchy, all the things that these conservatives have embedded in as what it really is to be Western. Right? Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a huge, I think, a big Putin fan, if you read a little description, she defines herself as a woman in a traditional female role. She's proud of the fact that she has this traditional female role, and as a housewife, she's also a politician in Congress, but as a housewife primarily, as a mother, as a Christian, these are the things that define her. And Putin represents all that. And they've loved Putin for a while now. He's got.
Bombing churches,
What's that?
women, and so on.
What's that?
By bombing churches, raping women, and doing.
But that's always been the case, right? That's always been the case. Religion is always, we're a religion of peace, except when we need to kill a bunch of people. It's always the ideal. So, and why is he bombing? And they tell you the excuse. Why is he actually doing the Ukraine thing? It's our fault. It's because he's fighting Western decadence. They believe when he says, I'm fighting Western decadence, they go, yes, finally, somebody's fighting Western decadence. Sometimes to fight Western decadence, you have to blow up some churches. And so when he says denazification, they don't read it quite as Nazis, because I don't know that they can conceptualize what a Nazi really is. They read it as he's fighting the left. And that to them is good enough, and that justifies pretty much anything, including divorce in the United States and separating the states out. What was the other thing?
The 19th century.
Yeah, I'll get to the 19th century in a second. There was, so that's the libertarians thing. So some libertarians, funnily enough, also have this kind of cultural conservatism, which is weird. Like, many of the anarchists in the U.S. are anti-immigration, which, for the U.S., put aside Europe, we can talk about European immigration, but immigration in the United States is not a threat on any level. And yet, here libertarians who believe in no state. I assume in a no-state world we can travel and we can go places, you don't need a passport, and I assume that's what they believe. But for America today, we need controls on immigration. Nobody can come in. It's ruining our culture. Well, and what are you going to do in an ANCAP? I don't get it. So maybe I don't understand ANCAPs, but there's this attitude among anarchists today: no immigration. We need a tradition. We need. So they are paleo libertarians, which is a new term for me, but that's how they're being defined. So I think that explains kind of libertarian conservatives. And listen to Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson has a thing where he talks about Putin, and he gets very angry and very passionate, and almost he turns into this like messianic figure. He's got this, this is what's going to happen to the world, and there's going to be, bloodshed, and we're going to die if we stand up to Putin. So first of all, it's fear. Putin's going to blow up the world we shouldn't upset him because he might blow up the world. so we should appease him, which he would never say about any other case, right? This is Jordan Peterson. You're supposed to be a man. You're supposed to stand up for your values. You're supposed to protect, right? But not when it comes to Putin. Putin we're scared of, right? But then you discover what the really is motivating is, no, Putin's actually the representative of Western civilization. It's the decadent West that is the enemy, not Putin. You know, and there's a sense in which the decadent West is the enemy, but in a different fight. Right now, Putin is the enemy. We can tolerate the decadent West for a little while so we can get rid of Putin, then we'll focus on the decadent West and try to improve it. But I think Jordan Peterson is the decadent West. I think he's the problem, not the solution. 19th century quickly. Certainly, there were some wars in other, you know, empire building and so on. You know, there's a big difference between those empire building wars in World War I and World War II, as you described. Those were cataclysmic. But not only World War, we know World War I and World War II because that's what, you know, it's recent history in many respects. But you know, the 30-year war killed more people per capita than World War I or World War II, maybe even combined. If you study the 30-year war, I don't even remember, it's Protestants and Catholics or something like that. You know, you guys slaughtered each other left and right in Europe, and it was unbelievably brutal because it was, you know, it was women and children and villages wiped out, and for what? For being of the wrong variation of Christianity. And the 100-year war, I mean, the wars in Europe were brutal, and at least in Europe, which was, you know, during that period was the area of civilization. But even in the East, in you know, China, there were wars, but they were small wars. They weren't wars on any kind of scale like this. You know, most of the deaths in India that the empire caused had to do with famines and stuff, and less to do with literal wars. It was relatively to human history, right? And we forget that India was a place with lots of wars before we showed up, before the British showed up, or before anybody else showed up. There were lots of wars in India between Muslims and Hindus, and conquests and empires and all kinds of stuff. So the 19th century, if you look at actual bloodshed, was a relatively peaceful era. And indeed, human history, certainly since the Enlightenment, is a period of declining violence, with the exception of World War I and World War II. We've seen a steady decline in violence across the board. There's the book by Steven Pinker, Better Angels of Our Nature, which I highly recommend. And he shows by every parameter of violence, with the exception of, I would say, state violence, but by every state violence for breaking the law, but by every act of violence, warfare, rape, murder, even stealing, violence has been in decline. Individuals has risen. We value each other more, and we're less likely to commit crimes against one another as well as crimes like war. So I do think the 19th century was special, and I do think World War I and World War II were caused by this shattering of, by the resurrection of pre-Enlightenment ideas. I think World War I and World War II were the resurrection of collectivistic ideas, you know, the manifestations of nationalism, again, a collectivistic ideology, the resurrection of certain mystical ideas that associate with nations and associate with the land and the state. And a rejection, and you can see that also in economics, a rejection ultimately of individualism, trade, capitalism, freedom, capitalism. And indeed, the era from World War I on is an era of declining economic liberties. We know that, but I think our whole attitude towards individual freedom has shifted from the late 19th, from the early 20th century to today, and has been in many realms in decline. In some realms, it's actually improved. The way we treat women, the way we treat minorities, in the early 20th century that led to those two wars. Yes.
I agree with some of your points, mainly the ones that prosperity likes peace, and the one about hypocrisy of politicians. However, I would like to dwell a little about the second one, because I would argue with you that every war since Napoleon was a war over the control of capital. For example, the war, First World War, why did it break out? Because at the time Germany was kind of the China of Europe. It was the cheap manufacturing hub, and it needed some kind of trade routes, free trade, which it strongly advocated for. And the reason that the First World War broke out was because the British were blocking the free trade routes. So the Germans were actually fighting for freedom of trade. And the Second World War was just like a second part of the First World War that has been conducted since World War II, shortly after the discovery of rich gas fields in the Donbass and the Kharkiv regions. So those wars, right, there were actually about...
Question that the First World War had something to do with empire, and with the fact that Germany was relatively late to empire, and it was trying to catch up to France and Britain. Britain was not blocking trade routes. Britain was actually ceding ground to the Germans in places like Africa. But clearly Germany was lagging, and Germany wanted to assert its destiny. Remember, this is not long after the unification of Germany, which happens in the late 19th century, and the beginning of this German destiny, German mythology, Germany are the chosen people. Germany should have a much bigger role in the world, and we need to assert ourselves. And not about capital. This is about, again, the German people, the German mythology, the German place in the world. We need to assert ourselves. And indeed, if you look even empire, if you look at empire, if you look at the British Empire was a massive negative impact on the British economy. It was a net capital export. Capital flew, to maintaining the empire was far more, had far more expenses than any revenue that flowed into the empire. One of the reasons the empire fell apart, the British Empire fell apart after World War II, is because Britain couldn't afford to hold it together anymore. That is, if the empire was a net beneficiary to England, then it would have kept going. But it wasn't. It was sucking capital out of England to the empire. Much better for England, looking back, would have been to protect free trade routes and to trade with India rather than occupy India. Occupation of India cost the British massive quantities of capital, and again, and indeed, if you look at the justification of empire, I don't think it was primarily economic. It started out economic, and then it became something else. It became about the white man's burden, in Rupert Kipling's terminology. World War II was certainly not about capital. It had nothing to do with capital.
Add something. Rupert Kipling was a tradesman.
Yeah, I mean, he grew up in India.
Reasoning was philosophical, but the whole idea behind the reasoning was the
no, it was about culture. It was about bringing the rest of the world Western civilization. It was not primarily about trade and about making money. Although, a lot of Brits made money, but as a whole, Britain lost money over the empire, not made money, and I think that's true of every empire. As those of us who, if you understand economics, you understand that you gain much more value from trading with people than occupying them and forcing them to do what you want them to do. You're going to make a lot more money by trading with them. War, as we started out, war is destructive to everybody. Everybody loses in war. Maybe there's some arm manufacturers that make money in war, but they're the only ones who make money in war. So World War II is clearly not about trade. World War II is clearly about a mystical vision that Hitler believes in and the people around him believe in, and that they project out and they convince the German people of this mystical vision, and they march to their death following this mystical vision.
So why did they attack Stalingrad, which is surrounded by oil fields?
Well, look, no. I mean, there's often in war you have to have oil to pump into the tanks. So one of the goals, but the target was not Stalingrad. The target was never Stalingrad. Why was the target in the beginning Poland and France? No natural resources, in particular in Poland and France, that the Germans needed. So ultimately, they needed to go to oil fields. That's why they wanted the Middle East, and they were trying to get to the Middle East in a couple of directions. You need the resources in order to put fuel in the tank so you can continue the war. The purpose of the war is not the natural resources. Natural resources, you need them in order to keep the war going. Now, I'm not saying natural resources don't have anything to do. Certainly, they have something to do with Russia right now, and have something to do. And the idea that the Iraq War was about oil is absurd and ridiculous. And I know everybody believes it, but it's just complete nonsense. No American oil company landed up benefiting from the Iraq War. The first World War, the first Iraq War, all the oil wells were lit on fire, and massive amounts of resources had to be put in to put those fires out. But who did those oil wells ultimately go back to? America? You see, if America wanted the oil, then it could have put troops on the ground, protected the oil fields, let the Iraqis go to hell in Baghdad and the other places, protected the oil fields and pumped them out for their needs, and American oil companies would have made a fortune. Instead, poor American kids, were slaughtered in Baghdad and what was the name of that? I forget the place. But all of these towns, they fought an insurgency, they fought all of this. And the oil was nationalized by the Iraqi government. America did nothing about the fact that it was nationalized by the Iraqi government. They didn't stop them from nationalizing it by the Iraqi government. And indeed, yeah, Siri does not like what I'm saying. And indeed, oil production dropped, not increased during the period. Oil prices, it didn't do good for oil prices. It didn't do good for anything American. America net lost on everything in Iraq, and there was nothing about motivation around oil driving that war.
What about Libya then? Like Libya was mainly, the war in Libya was mainly conducted by Spanish and French troops, which...
For what? For what? What?
Spanish company, Repsol, is currently draining oil fields.
See, I think you have, this is not meant to be an insult. It's I think meant to. You guys have a Marxist view of the world. Marx believed that the world is governed by economic processes. Everything's about the material world. Everything's about material stuff. It's not. The world is governed primarily by ideas and by stupid politicians doing stupid things and playing into the hands of different forces. I don't know much about the Libyan, what instigated this particular Libyan incident, but I would say that one of the symbols of Western weakness is that we allowed Muammar Gaddafi to survive as long as he did. This is a guy who blew up an airplane over Scotland. Literally, he gave the order to his intelligence agencies who got a bomb onto a Pan Am flight? I think it was a Pan Am flight that exploded over Lockerbie. Everybody knew he was at fault, and we were too afraid to do anything about it. So I think Reagan bombed the tent next to Muammar Gaddafi, but wouldn't actually bomb the tent he was in. So we let this bastard, who was clearly had a discotheque in Berlin, I think, that was blown up, with that Americans were in. Libyan intelligence, Libya did it. Nobody did anything to Muammar Gaddafi. So the fact that we let him survive as long as he did is a testament to Western weakness. Not that we finally got rid of the bastard when we did. So did somebody benefit from it? Yes, somebody stepped in, but that wasn't what motivated what happened. And you can't, the wars in Israel are not motivated by economics. And the Vietnam War was not motivated by economics. And the Korean War was not motivated by economics. And what other wars are there? Most of America's stupid wars are motivated by some sense of altruism, of going to helping people out in the world, not to take resources from them. What resources? America doesn't even exploit a fraction of its own resources.
So you're saying that that the mission of the American wars conducted in the let's say third world countries was to liberate those peoples?
I would say that in particular, the Iraq War is a war I know a lot about because I read everything and I studied it carefully. The Iraq War was motivated by a vision of bringing democracy to the Middle East. Yes, they believed it.
But that's Putin's vision.
No.
No, I'm not justifying the Iraq War. It's a wrong vision. I don't think that's good, right? I'm just saying it wasn't economics. It was motivated by an idea, a bad idea. And I criticized it at the time. You're not going to bring democracy to the Middle East by force, and particularly not that way. But that is the vision that guided the Bush administration, the people within the Bush administration. It wasn't about oil. It was about, whether you like it or not, it was about democracy. And they failed on that, and they failed on the oil. They failed by every parameter. But that's the vision that drove them, that really motivated them. That was what was in the Pentagon. The whole structure of the American army today, there are massive divisions within the American army devoted to building institutions, building democracy, helping the people out. Huge amounts of resources, billions and billions and billions of dollars motivated to create free countries in the places you occupy. Believe me, Russia doesn't have that kind of investment in building, a democracy in Ukraine.
They pretend to.
They don't even pretend to. He doesn't pretend. He wants to wipe out Ukrainians. Ukrainians aren't the people. The Ukrainians doesn't exist. It was the last speech he gave, right? There is no such thing as Ukraine. America has never said something like that, right? They are doing this for the Iraqi people, whether you believe them or not. That's the verbiage they used. And I think they believed it. I think Bush believed it. I think Cheney believed it. I think the neocons believe it. They have other reasons. They also believe, and I think Putin believes this. This is something I didn't talk about. They believe that war unites their own country. So a big reason why Putin, I think, invades Ukraine, why Putin needs a war, is that he needs legitimacy. He needs a justification for his own existence.
Don't you think the reason for all these processes are psychological? That the leadership wants to boost the ego of people, so they feel better about themselves, and
By killing them? By having them die?
No. What I mean is that the leadership, for example, of Putin's regime wants to boost the ego of Russia.
Yes, but it's not, he's not interested in the ego of Russia.
Yeah, but people feel better, so they...
Yes, they'll support him.
Better, so they support...
So he knows deep down he is an illegitimate leader. And he knows that he is always threatened by a 2014, revolution like was in Kiev. There's always the potential that he will be overthrown. And what he needs is legitimacy. War gives leaders legitimacy. It gives a cause to get people rallied around. It gives, what do they call it? A tonic, a spirit to the people, a kind of a pseudo self-esteem, a certain pseudo pride in their nation by winning victories. And I think the neoconservatives in America, and I think Putin certainly believes that he needs a war to hold Russia together and keep them motivated and certainly protect his own regime. Because he thought he would win quickly. He thought, this would be a crowning achievement. He would go down in history as this achiever of empire. I don't think Putin cares about natural resources. Putin cares about his legacy, and his legacy is greater Russia. He'll go down in history books as the Emperor Putin. That's what he wants. That's what he cares about. That's his psychology. He doesn't care about oil. He cares about Putin, Putin's legacy. And in that sense, he thought it would be quick and easy, and he would achieve his thing, and the West would fall apart and not support Ukraine. Ukrainians would be pathetic.
Why the timing? Why the timing that the first act of the Ukraine war happened right after the discovery of the gas pools in Ukraine?
I think some of that is accident. Some of that is, it's an excuse. Maybe he can use that to motivate certain segments of Russian society, but I don't think it's a major motivation. And why come now? He didn't need to do it now.
Don't you think that the so-called military-industrial complex in the United States has a relevant role in perpetuating American wars, interventions?
Somewhat, but I think it's a small element in perpetuating those wars. I don't think it's a big element. Again, I think wars, like most human events, but particularly important human events, are motivated by ideas not motivated by special interests. I don't think the military-industrial complex is what led to the war in Iraq. I don't think the military-industrial complex led to any of the modern American wars and participation in the wars. I don't think they're the ones now motivating U.S. support for, and that's the lack of a respect for individualism, a lack of respect for human life, which often political leaders exhibit, but political leaders of authoritarian regimes exhibit more because they don't care about human life. That's the essence of authoritarianism. But he doesn't bear the cost, although, you know, he has to fear that he will bear the cost, right? Because if they lose, he's not going to survive. So, it's not completely cost-free. There is skin in the game here. There really is skin in the game, and he has to really be worried. And I think he is worried. I think that's why he's so depressed and so miserable, because he's worried. He's losing, and if he loses, he will suffer consequences. The powers to be in Moscow won't let him be. So yes, I think that's an element, but I think it goes to the value of human life, which goes to the idea of whether you respect the individual or don't respect the individual. And in the United States, as the United States' respect for the individual and individualism has declined, Americans are much more likely to send their troops into battle for no reason, to be slaughtered for no good reason. You see that. I don't know if you've read on some of the stuff that's happened in Afghanistan, and you look at the war in Afghanistan, and you find me the economic interest that would motivate the sacrifice of young American kids in Afghanistan for nothing, zero, zilch, to gain the respect of the Afghani people who have no economic value, no natural resources, nothing, zero. There's a good movie called The Outpost. I think it's called The Outpost. True story, about a true story about an outpost of Americans surrounded by Taliban, and the way the American government and American military leadership treat them, and basically, lead them to the slaughter. Just allow all these kids to get slaughtered and killed, and the politicians and the generals don't give one iota, right? And there's no natural resource there. There's no benefit there. There's nothing. All it is appeasement and a mythology of bringing democracy, turning Afghanistan into a wonderful country for the benefit of whom? Not for America. America gains nothing from it. And then you leave, they thoroughly defeated. Nobody benefited anything from what they did over there.
How do you explain the fact that the motivation that those dictators used to capture their nations? For example, Hitler didn't capture them with the German nation with the promise of greatness. He captured them with the promise of the so-called Lebensraum, which is room to live, and the war with Poland was about Lebensraum.
Yeah, but there was no shortage of room to live. This is again.
Germany, there was.
No, there was not. There isn't. There's never a shortage of room to live. There's nowhere in Europe where there's a shortage of room to live. What it is again a zero-sum mentality, a mentality of the only way to increase your resources is not through production, not through innovation, not through trade, but through occupation and through proving to the world the superiority of your own race and your own being. And that was a massive feature of everything Hitler did from the beginning on, was the superiority of Germans over everybody else and the fact that they needed to rule. They didn't just need land for the Germans, but they needed to rule other people. They needed to be elevated above everyone else.
While respecting your points about like the American libertarians being blind contrarians, you could say, in many respects, isn't it also reasonable to primarily think about the people who are enslaving you today, rather than about people who are being used to often also cement their power, the power of the current oppressors?
So if they took the attitude of, we don't care. We don't care about the Ukraine war. We're not taking sides. We're just sitting this out. You know, our enemy is the United States. We're just going to focus on the United States. And I'd say maybe. I still think that's cowardly, because I'm not asking them to go fight in Ukraine. I'm just asking them to say there's a good guy and a bad guy. Now, the good guy's not perfect. The good guy's not wonderful. The good guy's just good in contrast to the bad guy. So all they have to say is Putin is a monster, which he is. Ukraine was heading towards a better place. It was moving towards the West. That's its sin. That's what Putin couldn't tolerate. He was heading towards westernization. They're better. They're not great. They're corrupt. They're not capitalist. They don't, all this stuff we know. But they're better. That's all I'm asking them. Not to send their kids to fight. Not even to send them money to fight. They could even object to the U.S. supplying weapons. Just make them take them all a stand. But it's indicative to me that libertarians in the United States, and maybe in Poland, I don't know, say nothing about what's going on in Iran. I don't know if you know what's going on in Iran, but what's going on in Iran, where young girls are fighting for their freedom, for their liberty, and the liberty movement says nothing. I thought we stood for liberty. Individual liberty means wearing what you want, for example, and not having a theocracy, for example. And yet the liberty movement is silent on Iran, which is mind-boggling to me. Here's finally a people standing up and rejecting oppression. So there's something going on that I think is deeper than that, and I think is much more about not caring about liberty, in spite of claiming to be pro-liberty, and second, a certain hatred of America, a certain resentment of America and the enemies, Iran. I've heard libertarians defend Iran. Hey, the Iranian people chose to have a theocracy. Who are we to challenge that? Well, now some Iranian people. Well, anyway. You can't justify authoritarianism if you supposedly have liberty in the title of your ideology. And yet they are. So I think it's much more than just, I'm worried about the American government, I don't want to worry about that. Fine. But that's not what they're saying. They're literally become part of, as you said, part of the propaganda, Putin propaganda machine. Yeah.
Just one short comment about the Polish liberty movement, Yaron.
Yeah.
I would say that in comparison to the American one, the Polish one is almost reasonable on most of the cases you
Good.
mentioned before, and there are even some the Polish one. No, the Polish liberty movement. So
no, I mean I get. That's good.
There are even people from Polish liberty movement that were started some, let's say, intellectual debates or even fights. For example, with the guys from Alabama, from Mississippi.
Good. Good.
For example, there is a good friend of mine who wished to publish some texts about the Putin-Russian invasion in Ukraine, and they said, no, we like you, but you can write about economics, and that's it. But no, do not meddle us with all this Russian stuff and so on and so forth. So I would say that not in terms of political power, but in terms of third sector think tanks and so on, most of the liberty-oriented people in Poland, including most of the self-described Polish libertarians, are at least anti-Putin, anti-Russian regime, are recognizing that Ukraine is defending itself, not the bad Nazis people. So there are some discussions, and the libertarian guys in America are often surprised. Why you are libertarian? Why aren't you thinking the way we are? And so on
we
and so
are
forth.
closer to the Russian border.
Exactly, close to the Russian border. Maybe you're also better. It might be that you're better thinkers. You're also closer to communism, to the memory of communism and authoritarianism. So good. I mean, I'm not surprised, but good. And I hope it lasts, and I hope it goes beyond Russia. I know for you Russia's a big deal because they're right there. I think that direction. I don't know, somewhere. But that way, yeah. But yes, I think we should all be horrified by what is going on in the liberty movement, or what they call the liberty movement in the United States, because it suggests that maybe it's not about liberty. Yeah.
Thank you for describing the state of Putin apologists in America, which is quite worrying. But, since, as I understand, you were born in Israel, maybe you could offer a perspective of the second most perplexing thing I see in the world, like the Israeli policy towards a guy who is Putin, who is probably the best reenactment of Hitler the world has seen in the last decades, who started genocidal invasion. His neighbor, the goals of the invasion are not only to conquer territory, but by actions in the war, so the Russians are to basically wipe out the Ukrainians as a nation. Zelensky himself is a Jew. And yet we see both governments, both left wing, now the right wing, not only washing hands off, but they like proactively stopping Europeans from supplying any weapons,
Israeli weapons,
any slightest Israeli equipment, and still they supplied Russia with drones, the drone technology. That happened even after, maybe not.
I don't think since the war started, but maybe before.
After the war started, before the escalation started, so like a few years ago.
So, so first, let me say, I'm appalled by what the Israeli government is doing with regard to Russia. I think it's ridiculous, and it's disgusting, and it shows immense weakness. I also want to just correct one thing. The previous government was not a left-wing government. There is no left wing in Israel. There just isn't a left in Israel. The left is tiny, and they're not left of Netanyahu, because Netanyahu's center-right, and most of the previous government was center-right. There were some leftist elements, but most of it was center-right. They just hate each other's guts. Israeli politics is more about the personalities than about ideas. On every issue, most Israeli politicians agree. It's on the personalities that they don't agree. Israeli politics is a very bizarre, stupid thing. But I mean, particularly politics generally is pretty stupid. Israeli politics is particularly. Like Bennett and Netanyahu, the previous prime minister and this prime minister, don't disagree on almost anything, right? They're both center-right people. Why are they appeasing Putin? You know, I'll give my explanation. I don't know. You know, I haven't talked to them. I'm taking this from the state of the Middle East and from what they say, and I think mainly it's Syria and Iran. So Russia has established itself as the dominant player in Syria. Russia controls the airspace in Syria. It has S-400 anti-aircraft batteries and maybe even the more advanced anti-aircraft batteries in Syria. It has an Air Force base there. It has ships in the Mediterranean. Russia has real forces in Syria. It is basically sided with Assad and they're trying to bolster Assad. Through that, they are, in a sense, supporting the Iranians, because the Iranians are moving in from Iran and they're moving into Syria. But Putin has cut a deal with the Israelis. And basically the deal is, we will let you Israelis do what you want in the airspace over Syria vis-a-vis the Iranians, as long as you let us do what we want in the Middle East, and now I think as long as you don't supply the Ukrainians with weapons, right? So Israel's afraid to piss off the Russians, because the Russians are right there. They're on the Israeli border with pretty advanced weapon systems. Now I think it's a massive mistake, because I don't think Israel has anything to fear from Russia. My suspicion is that the Israeli military could wipe out whatever Russian military is in Syria. You know, it won't be like that, but it would be pretty easily, given what Ukraine is doing. The Israelis Israel has far more advanced weapon systems than but that's the fear that they have. They're worried that Russia will stop them from controlling the Iranians. And right now, Israel's priority is Iran.
Russia is supplying Iran with weapons.
Well, that's a relatively recent phenomenon, where Iran is supplying Russia with weapons, drones, and Russia is supplying Iran with weapons. That happened recently. And there's already starting to be talk in Israel. Now, the Israeli public supports Ukraine overwhelmingly. But the politicians and I think the military are worried of pissing off the Russians, and the Russians supporting the Iranians even more. And see, as long as Iran stays in Iran, Israel doesn't have too much of a problem with them because they have anti-missile technology and they can, once in a while, they disrupt their nuclear stuff, so they're not that worried. But once the Iranians start coming to the Israeli border, which is Syria and Lebanon, and giving advanced weapon systems to Hezbollah in Lebanon, that's when the Israelis are worried. And so that path from Iran into Syria into Lebanon, that's what Israel wants to disrupt. And right now they rely on the Russians to let them do it without any cost, without any problem, without going to war with Russia. They're worried that if they support Ukraine, Russia would stop them from taking out the Iranian supply chain. And that's what really worries the Israelis. The Israelis are terrified by the Iranians. So they're willing to sacrifice Ukraine, or to give up Ukraine for the sake of maintaining their ability to, bomb the Iranians at will in Syria. And once in a while you'll hear, I assume you hear it in Poland, Israel just bombed Damascus, right? Well, they're not bombing Damascus randomly, they're bombing Iranian facilities within Damascus and the surroundings of Damascus. And they don't have to deal with Russian anti-aircraft in order to do that. Now, I think they could deal with Russian anti-aircraft. I think they have the technology to do it. They just don't want to get into the situation where they're bombing and killing Russians. So call it weak, I do. Call it pretty pathetic, I do. But that's kind of the realpolitik of it in terms of what the Israeli government is thinking. And that's why everybody agrees on it, because the priority is Iran, and everybody agrees that that's a priority. Yeah.
What do you think about this idea of having this national divorce that you mentioned in the United States, where red states are going their own way,
Yeah.
and blue states are going their own
Yeah.
way? Would it be something good or not?
Or secession in general?
Yeah. And how would you comment on another idea that I carved, which goes even further, and the idea is that we will either have a peaceful divorce now, or we will
Or a civil war ultimately.
bloody civil
Yeah.
war in the long term.
No, I think it's a horrible idea. I think it's a defeatist idea. I think it's an irrational idea. I think it's the end of America. And I don't think anybody benefits from it. And I think it's not practical. I don't think it's possible. And I don't think a civil war is possible. America's far more complicated than red states and blue states. I'll give you an example. In Texas is a red state, right? We all know Texas is the red state, right? Solid red. Austin, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, 9 of the top 10 metropolitan areas in the Hindus were all kicked out of Pakistan, and you swap populations? Really? Is that what we're going to do? And then who wants to live in a red state? I wouldn't want to live in a red state. I mean, the assumption people are making is red is good, blue is bad. I wouldn't want to really live in a red state. You couldn't pay me enough money to live in a red state. I'd probably leave America if that was what was going to happen. But what's the virtue of Texas without Austin? What's the virtue of Texas without Dallas? Really? I mean, we might make fun of blue CRT and woke and all this stuff, but blue also means the symphony orchestra and plays and culture and a lot of the values that make America an interesting place. So it's not realistic. 45% of Texas is blue. And 45% of the most interesting part of Texas is blue. The universities, the scientists, the entrepreneurs, I think everybody's a loser. I think the blue states become bluer, which is bad for them, and the red states become redder, and it's bad for them. Because I think both blue and red are bad.
But in general, isn't forced unity, forced solidarity, forced being a part of the same organism?
But you're not forced. You are part of the same organism. The reality is that you as an individual, if you don't like a blue state, you can move to a red state. You as an individual, if you don't like a red state, you can move to a blue state. So you have freedom of movement within the country. So you're not forced to be participating in blue-red. You can move states based, and the fact is, the reality is, 99% of Americans don't move. So they seem pretty happy with where they are, right? We always say your actions indicate your actual values more than what you claim, but there's very little movement. Yes, there's some movement out of California, there's some movement out of New York, but most of the movement out of New York is because of the weather, not because it's blue, but because it's cold. And most of the movement into Florida is not because of the color of Florida, but because it's warm. So it's old people move to Florida. Why do old people move to Florida? Because it's warm and they're retired and they can move to Florida. So we overemphasize these differences. And the reality is that most of America is not like Make America Great Again, or crazy Trumpists or crazy leftists. Most of America is in the middle. And most of America likes America. Most of America wants America. What Texas would do by leaving the United States is force a significant portion of the population, probably a vast majority of the population of Texas, to leave the United States. They want to be Americans. Most Americans want to be Americans. It's the extremes, which are a tiny minority, that don't want to be part of an America, that have given up on the American project, given up on the idea of liberty and freedom. And look, I think secession, if you're seceding to make things worse, a la freedom, is evil. It's wrong. It's absolutely should be opposed, and absolutely you should go to war over it. I'm a huge fan of the Civil War. Absolutely the North should have invaded the South and suppressed what the South was doing. You can't secede in order to suppress, in order to enslave people. You can't secede in order to violate individual rights. The whole point of a federation is to protect individual rights. As soon as they're threatened, you say, okay, you can go your own way, go abuse those people over there. No, the whole point of a federation is to protect those rights, the individual's rights. The individual's rights when they're being oppressed by the state. So you want to create a federation to protect the individual from the state. That's why rights of the individual on a massive time secession is good. The only time secession should be supported. And I don't think red states want to create something freer. I don't think anybody in America believes in freedom in the political sense, in the political environment. Red states want to oppress us in one way, and blue states want to oppress us in a different way. Choose your poison.
Well, America is one example. However, we have had a long example of smaller German states being much more peaceful, much more pro-free market, exchange, and all of that thing.
Again, 30-year war, small German states slaughtered each other. This idea that small is good and small is peaceful is just nonsense. Catalonia wants to leave Spain so they can become a little socialist republic and oppress their people more than they have before. Scotland, certainly if it left the UK, would become dominantly socialist. Why anybody who believes in liberty would want to support secession for the sake of socialism, I don't understand. They're staying in the UK keeps the individuals within Scotland freer, even if they don't recognize it, even if they don't know it. And what about the minority of Scots who want to stay a part of the UK? You're suppressing their individual rights. So no, freedom always triumphs, and freedom actually triumphs. We're actually much more peaceful in bigger units rather than smaller units. The most peaceful period in all of European history has been the European Union. It's unbelievably peaceful. There are lots of problems with it, but war is not one of them, thank goodness, right? That particular brutality is not one of them. And indeed, the one war we have is on the fringe of the European Union, and if it was part of the European Union, there wouldn't be the war. So, no, establishing big units, you don't want one unit, the whole world, but you want several big units, is actually a way to reduce conflict and reduce violence, not to increase it. The more fragmented we are, the more violent we are. And the best place to see that is not far from here, just south. Go to the Balkans. They're still trying to kill each other over little pieces of land because this is mine and this is yours. And you're treating my ethnic group a little differently than your ethnic group and da-da-da. Who the fuck cares? What ethnic group anybody is? what color, what tribal origin the leader of the group is. The only thing that matters is liberty and freedom. And it doesn't matter who rules. And the fact is that the smaller the unit becomes, the more tribal it becomes, the more authoritarian it becomes, and the less the individual matters.
So on the individual level, the individual would matter the least.
Would what?
Would matter the least.
No, he matters the most. That's the funny thing in history. The country that has respected individual rights the most is one of the biggest countries in the world, and that's the United States of America. And it's the most diverse country with the most diverse people. Came lots of Poles and Irish and Italians and Mexicans, and all these people came together in one big continent with one big federal government and respected individual rights and were relatively peaceful, much more than Europe was.
A quick follow-up question. You said, Yaron, that 99% of Americans are sitting...
Not 99%, maybe it's 80%.
Okay,
The majority of Americans are sitting in the middle. Yes.
So this whole American, let's say, culture of migration, culture of changing states and places, it's on the decline? It's gone? Or?
Oh yeah, movement between states. The Americans moving generally is way in decline. It was much higher 50 years ago.
When does it start to go down?
With the welfare state. The welfare states provide you with all kinds of incentives to stay put.
The Great Society and...
The Great, well, even before that, starting with the Great Depression, because what it does is, if you lose your job, you don't go looking for a job. You stay put, and you get welfare. And then, politicians tell you, don't worry, we're bringing the steel industry back, so you can stay in Cleveland, when there are plenty of jobs in Arkansas. But who wants to go to Arkansas when I can stay in Cleveland and get welfare checks? Also, what happens is a lot of American welfare programs are not federal, they're state-based. So once you sign up for welfare and food, all these things at state, you lose that when you move to another place. There also, real estate is an issue. There's a lot, the most attractive places to move to in the United States, we build the fewest houses. So real estate prices are really, really expensive. So I know it's shocking, but a lot of people would love to move to California. How do we know? Like, we like economics, right? This is an economic leg. How do we know lots of people want to move to California? Because demand for real estate is higher than the supply, because prices keep going up. But they can't move to California because there's not enough supply of housing. If California built a huge number of housing, the movement of people might shift in spite of the fact that California is blue and therefore evil and therefore nobody should move there, right? So it's not that simple. These things are not simple, right? If you look at blue states, which are the blue states? They're the states, the net contributors of tax revenue to the federal government, i.e. they're the producers. Most of the red states are net recipients of government. They're the welfare states. So it's not true that red states are more productive than blue states. It just isn't the reality in America. So there's a lot of complexity. And you know what the real split in America is? It's not blue-red. It's rural-urban. Rural America is red. Urban America is blue. So in California, for example, the Central Valley and north of San Francisco, but way north of San Francisco, so not that close to San Francisco, is all red. All the rural areas in California are red. It's the urban centers that are blue. And that's true in Texas, Austin, but not, I always thought Austin, yes, Austin's a university town, we all know, but Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, well, San Antonio, okay, they're Hispanics, but even they should be red. Why wouldn't they be red? All blue. Every single one of the major metropolitan areas. All the richest counties in the United States. I think 9 out of 10 of the richest counties in the United States, blue. Right? It's not, these things are not simple. And it's not like red represents liberty and freedom. Red represents a certain type of oppression and blue represents a different type of oppression. Again, choose your poison. I'm for liberty. I'm not for red or blue. I don't consider myself left or right anymore. The right is completely, at least in America, and I think in Poland too, completely corrupt. And the left, of course, is corrupt. the real spectrum in politics is individualism and collectivism. And today, the left and the right are both collectivist. And almost nobody is individualistic. And, you know, there are classical liberals and there are objectivists and some libertarians who maybe are individualists, but that's it. And then there's a vast majority of, let's say, Americans who kind of in the middle, who have a tendency towards individualism, but not, they don't really have the backbone. They don't really have the understanding of what that is.
Maybe it's a broad question, but what's
Sure.
your perspective on the Israel and Palestine conflict? I'm just curious.
I mean, it's a complicated issue, and it depends on when and so on. But my broad sense, my broad perspective of the history of it is that the Jews who came to Israel built a basically free state. Basically free. It's far from perfect, all the caveats, and it's an ethnic-centered state, which is not a good thing either. But it is a basically free state, and they brought civilization, they brought trade, they brought production, they brought culture. They built a Western civilization in this place. And from the beginning, the Palestinians rejected them because...
Isn't it that the Israelis oppressed the freedom of
No,
Palestinians?
no, it's not. It just isn't. If you look at the history, the Jews who came, they bought property. They bought property from landowners, Turks, Syrians, Palestinians, whoever was there. They cultivated the land, they dried swamps, they created industries. The first electrification of Israel, of that part of the world, under the British occupation, and all provided by Jewish capital and people who moved in and built this and created this. And the Palestinians, from very early on, you know, starting in 26 or 27, 36, kept, you know, violently, you know, trying to push them out and get rid of them. And then in 1947, the United Nations said, look, the Jews here, the Palestinians, the Arabs here, we'll have two states. Jews will have this little sliver, and the Palestinians will have this little sliver, because if you've ever been to Israel, it's like tiny, right? So we'll have two countries in this tiny little space. And the Jews, literally, the Jews went out the next day and celebrated. Cool, we're going to get a state, this is amazing. And the Palestinians the next day started shooting. And that's the reality. And then in May of 1948, when the British said we're leaving, and the Jews said, okay, we're declaring independence of our own state, you know, 7 armies from 7 different countries invaded what was called Palestine to try to kick the Jews out of there. And Israel's been on the defense since then. Now, is everything Israel does from that perspective right? No. Is everything they do just? No. But in comparison, again, it's like Ukraine, Russia, right? In comparison, if you compare the two, Israel is an angel as compared to the attitude of the Palestinian and the Arab world. They're not angels, but in comparison, they're good guys, and the Palestinians and the Arab world are the bad guys.
But the Palestinians say that Jews took their land.
They're lying. They're lying. They really are. Now, look, they did take some of the land in a war, right? Just like, you know, lots of the land in Europe it was determined by who won a particular war. If you win a war and people leave their villages and run away, are you obliged to bring them back even though they won't recognize your existence and even though they want to murder you? No. So a lot of Arab villages, when the Arabs left in 1948 and went to Jordan or went to ultimately land up in refugee camps in Lebanon, they all left. Is Israel, you know, does Israel occupy those villages? Sure, but that's what happens in war. If you lose, you lose. Don't start wars, because if you lose land, you're not going to get it back. So, you know, it's on the Palestinians. If they hadn't started the war in 1948, there would be 2 states. And by the way, there have been multiple times in history over the last 65 years where the Palestinians were offered a state, and Israel was willing to accept a Palestinian state. And the Palestinians said no, because they didn't get the last 1% of what their demands were. They don't want peace. The leadership, Palestinian people, like all people, I think, they want peace, they want to take care of their families, they want to earn a living, they're just like everybody, but the Palestinian leadership has betrayed the Palestinians over and over and over, the decades, starting in the early 20th century and all the way to today. Yasser Arafat was a monster, and the fact that he led the Palestinians destroyed the Palestinians' hope for peace, and he was offered a Palestinian state, and he turned it down in Camp David in, was it 99 or something? So, again, in comparison, Israelis are the good guys and the Palestinians are the bad guys. Okay, last question, I guess. Tomik says the last one.
Okay, in the context of what you said, big states being better at protecting individual rights than smaller states.
I mean, it doesn't have to be better, right, if it has the right ideas, right? But small states almost guarantee are going to fight with one another and they're not going to protect rights.
How would you comment on the idea of turning European Union into one federal government, just like the United States?
You're going to get me in trouble. You're going to get me in trouble. I mean, I think that should be the goal long term, not under current conditions because you guys in Europe are way too leftist and you would destroy yourself, so you'd commit suicide. But I think ultimately, yeah, I mean, I go to Prague and I go to Bratislava and I go Czech, Slovakia, and you understand each other's languages. It's almost the same language. You look exactly the same. You have almost the same culture. What the hell? This difference. And who lost on that? Slovakians, because Prague liberalized their economy a lot faster than Slovakia did, so they're much richer than Slovakia. It's just these silly disputes you have over, the tiny little bit of cultural differences between, Poles and, Germans are special, but, a ridiculous long term. Now, it's going to take a long time, right? But, the fact that there's not more mobility within Europe suggests that you're still committed to your little tribes. Right? People don't go to where the work is, again, maybe because of welfare. Right? So if you lose your job in Poland and you get welfare, you're less motivated maybe to go to Spain where there are jobs. Or Spanish don't move somewhere else because they get their welfare in Spain and they don't go find jobs somewhere else. And so, yeah, I think it should be a federation of states, ultimately. Once you lose, and hopefully we can erode some of the tribal attitudes that you have, and kind of the nationalistic attitudes that you have, and I think the world benefits. I mean, if I see a kind of a liberty future, if I can imagine a future where people respect individual rights and are pro-liberty and capitalism and everything like that, I think the world has, 50 countries total, right? It doesn't have 200. Like South America, most of them speak Spanish, they should be one country. Well, what's the difference between Chile and Argentina and Colombia and Peru? And yeah, there are differences in culture and so on, but they're irrelevant to the issue of liberty. If you really have freedom, why do we need 75 or 200 countries? Brazil should be a separate country because they have a separate language, and it's a. Here you'd have to figure out what language to use. As long as it's not German, I'm fine with it. But the real risk of a unified Europe is, Germany. But that's why you can't do it today. You have to do it in a world of individualism, and we don't have a world of individualism today. But the worst thing that could happen to Europe is to break it up into city-states, right? Because then you'd be at each other's throats constantly. At least you have a few big countries that are unlikely to go to war in the current situation, and partially because of the EU, because you're so connected to one another. There's so many shared values and so much trade and so many benefits that it would be hard to see another war in Europe between big states. But if there were tiny little fragmented states, look again at just the daily problems they have in the Balkans. Because they have these tiny little states. It's not even clear that they're sustainable as tiny little states, but the ethnicities. See, it's like the blue and red. The ethnicities don't quite follow the borderline, so there are conflicts within any particular little state about the particular ethnicities, and the clashes between them, and that can spiral into wars and genocide and whatever. If not for the European Union, Would Serbia and Kosovo be at peace right now? No. I mean, Europe is threatening them. They're telling them basically stop this fighting. But if Europe didn't intervene, they would be at each other's throats right now. And so would the rest of the Balkans. I mean, I went to Montenegro. You go to Montenegro, it's one town. It's not even a city. It's like 500,000 people. And they're proud of being, heirs of some Montenegrin tribe that arrived there in some century, who knows when. Who cares? But that kind of pride in your heritage, going back thousands of years, is what's destroying the human race. You know, be proud of your achievements as an individual. Live your life. Why do you need 500,000 people who shared the same tribal ancestry as you did in order to feel comfortable? And again, this is what makes America great. And this is why America's been the greatest country in the world for so long. It's the fact that it doesn't have that or didn't have that. And now we're becoming tribal in America, and America is going to descend, and we want to splinter it, and we want to break it up. It's going to become like Europe, which is not a compliment.
Do you see a way out of this move out of rationalism into extremism and ignorance? Because it's happening at the same time with the pinnacles reached by the human science and culture, but this is creating, it's a paradox, but it's creating a very toxic mix in which humanity achieved also a way to destroy itself. So you cannot even comfort yourself that your own country is pure, your own community is functioning, because we are able to destroy the earth if majority of humanity don't act together.
The way out is the same as the way in. That is, the way out is ideas. We got to this place because bad ideas, primarily German bad ideas. So let's reject German bad ideas and embrace good ideas. And that's the only way to do it. And that's why it can't happen quickly. It's a slow process. But just like the bad ideas slowly infiltrated and slowly took over the world, the whole 19th century is basically German philosophy corrupting the rest of the world. And we got World War I and World War II as a consequence of bad German ideas, in my view. Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Marx, Nietzsche. That string of ideas has corrupted the world. We need better ideas than those. We get some of those in there's the Ukrainian flag in the background. They can't see it on the video. But we got some of those in Enlightenment from people like John Locke and the French Enlightenment, the British and Scottish Enlightenment. And then we've got Ayn Rand, we've got Mises, we've got people who have good ideas. We need to embrace those ideas. We need to educate people about those ideas. And they all need to be centered around, I think, 3 fundamental concepts: reason, individualism, and freedom. And on every one of those, we're losing the battle. But those are the things that we need to teach the world, and we need to help educate the world, and we help change the world. And if we can do that, nothing is deterministic. History is not determined, as Marx said. Nothing's inevitable. It's up to us. This is why I get so upset when people claiming to be advocates of liberty are fans of a dictator. Or I get upset when people who claim to be fans of liberty are kind of bored by a bunch of young girls standing up to the authorities and declaring their independence, which I think should make all of us, excited and want to support them. If we don't fight for these ideas, if we don't fight for this cause, then the world is finished. So it's up to us. It's up to every one of us to fight for them, to educate, to talk, to write, to let the world know that there are better ideas of peace. Again, capitalism is the system of peace. Capitalism leads to peace. When we have capitalism, when we embrace capitalism, which means individualism and trade, we get peace. And when we don't, we get war. And we're moving away from capitalism and individualism, so we'll get more wars.
All right, so...
Thank you.
Thank you, Yaron.
Oh, wait. I'm going to get fired if I don't say this. All right, the flyer's up here. You can get a free Ayn Rand book. There's a barcode, and you can scan the barcode, and it'll take you to a page with all of Ayn Rand's books. You can choose which book you want, and it'll download for free. So anything from Atlas Shrugged to her nonfiction, any book you're missing in your library or you haven't read Ayn Rand yet, you can get that there. There is a conference in Athens in early April. You can apply for a scholarship, all expenses covered, flights, hotels, and everything. It's quite competitive because we got a lot of applications, but you never know, you could get it. So there's also a flyer there with a barcode that you can scan and fill out the application. And then if you've read Ayn Rand and you're familiar with the books and you're interested in kind of a reading group that will talk about her essays or talks about some of her books and stuff, we're forming reading groups that will include Europeans, that include this time zone, and you can sign up for those as well, and that's also free. And if you're interested in taking another step to really educating yourself about Ayn Rand and objectivism, we do have the Ayn Rand University. You can sign up for that. You can audit it, or you can sign up as a full-time student. We literally have graded classes with exams and homework and tests and a whole program. It's a 3-year program. And it's growing and it's big, and I encourage you all to sign up for it.
What I wanted to say was exactly the same.
Yeah, but
we are arranging actually a Polish team going to Ayn Rand in Athens.
Yes.
So if you'd like to somehow join us, or if you're planning to go, just chat with me. I hope we all can chat soon upstairs, and Yaron will stay with us for.
Yeah, and please, when you fill out the application of scholarship, take it seriously and give it some content, because if it's just quick, because it's competitive, make an effort. But it's worth it.
Before Ayn Rand in Athens, so we are having next month, end of March, Weekend of Capitalism, the largest Polish libertarian event. So if you want to attend, just go to weekendcapitalism.pl or talk to me. Maybe I will find some discount codes for you. And I hope we all will meet there soon. Director of Ayn Rand Institute Europe, Nikos, is coming as a speaker there as well. So there is also another opportunity to explore our ideas. Please follow Yaron. Please follow us on Facebook, etc. And let's go upstairs for a beer. Thank you.
Yeah. I am on YouTube, so please subscribe. Let me stop the streaming. So it seemed to work?